I want to introduce you to Faye Annam Avis, an intriguing individual and a heck of a nice guy. He didn't approve this introduction, by the way. I hope it's okay. You won't believe? No. Currently, Faye and Sean live in Greenville, and Faye truly sees the world from 30,000 feet because early in his life he was an engineer for Kodak, and he oversaw work in aerial reconnaissance. So he might say something about that. I don't know. You can ask him. Presbyterian pastor and the author of many books, and they all have intriguing titles. The Elephant in the Boardroom, Speaking the Unspoken about pastoral transitions. The Fly in the Ointment, Why Denominations Aren't Helping Their Congregations and How They Can. Penguins in the Pews, Climate, Change, and Church Growth. Owl Sight, Evidence-Based Discernment and the Promise of Organizational Intelligence for Ministry. And a book called Peak, Parents of Estranged Adult Kids. He's going to talk about that some today. He's written probably at least that many more books. Faye has launched several successful consulting gigs as a side hustle. Holy Cow Consulting, which is about congregational development. Something called Soul Shop, which is intended to bring conversations into congregations about suicide. Faye powerfully says, if you can use the word suicide in a sentence, you can save a life. He's going to be doing a presentation on the 20th in Columbus. I don't know if that's open to the public or not. Is it?
Saluda.
That's in Saluda it is? Oh, Saluda, yeah, not Columbus. Thank you. We can send out some details about that. Soul Shop, his extension to the African American community was landed an incredible feature article in Ebony magazine. So it's big time stuff he's up to. And now the Peak program that he started and is currently finishing another book about a national program addressing the painful realities facing parents of estranged adult kids. Faye transitioned from his work in tall steeple churches, as we call it in the trade, when he went on a humanitarian mission, serving in Honduras in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch in 1998. The deadliest hurricane on record since the 1700s. He's a man of many talents, great vision. We welcome you this morning, Brother Faye, to our fellowship.
So, thank you for giving me an opportunity to be with you today. Thanks, Lyndon. Always good to be with my friend Lyndon and Maria. I want to talk to you a little bit about a guy named Joe. Joe's not his real name. That's not his real picture. But Joe just retired from the military and from the Army. And here's the story. Joe is having a lot of difficulty. He's having symptoms that are depression. He's having elevated levels of anxiety. And he's finding himself emotionally triggered by memories. He is not sleeping well. He is developing physical symptoms. He has developed a cardiac issue with arrhythmia. He is having GI problems as well. He is having anger issues. He has a heightened startle response to loud sounds. And when you hear this story about Joe, you may make three assumptions. The first is he's suffering from PTSD, and that would be accurate. These are trauma symptoms that he is manifesting. The second assumption you may make is that comes from combat. In reality, he was never in combat. His trauma symptoms come from the fact that 6 months ago, his 35-year-old daughter said, "I never want to see you again." And this is what we are seeing with estranged parents, trauma symptoms. It's part of what we are dealing with now. Paula Spann, in an article in the New York Times, talks about how family estrangement is finally beginning to get some attention, but it has been so shameful that people hesitate to talk about it. Now, the common narrative about somebody like Joe is, and you'll read this in the New York Times, you'll read this in the Atlantic, you'll see it on 60 Minutes, is that parents are abusive, addicted, neglectful, neurotic, controlling, poor listeners, self-centered, demanding, preoccupied, and their adult children, in order to survive, have to cut them off. That is the common narrative, and you're going to read it just about everywhere. And strangely, it seems that these characteristics are only seen in this older generation and not in the younger generation at all. Once upon a time, I was a perfect parent, then I had children. The end. So I have never met, and I've now had correspondence with hundreds of estranged parents. I've never met an estranged parent who said I was a perfect parent. I've also never met an estranged parent who felt that whatever difficulties they had as a parent rose to the level where estrangement was the solution. So this narrative is the third assumption that we might make about Joe, which is that he was a bad parent. In fact, Joshua Coleman, who is one of the leading experts on parental estrangement in the United States today, deals with hundreds and hundreds of estranged parents, writes this in the Atlantic. My recent research and my clinical work over the past 4 decades have shown that you can be a conscientious parent and your kid may still want nothing to do with you when they're older. And this is indeed the reality that we are finding today as we work with estranged parents. Now, I've seen a lot in my 72 years, as Lyndon has spoken about. I worked in satellite reconnaissance for a number of years. I was Presbyterian minister for 23 years, figured out I was not predestined to do that all my life. You have to kind of be a Presbyterian to get that. I did relief work in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch killed 8,000 people, displaced 1 million people in a country of only 5.5 million. Started a project for abandoned HIV children in Honduras. Honduras has the highest rate of AIDS in Central America. Only 17% of the population, but it had 60% of the AIDS cases, most of them under the age of 20. So I did that work, and then started Soul Shop, which, as London talked about, was about equipping congregations to deal with suicidal desperation. So I've seen a lot of people in trouble, but I've never encountered the amount of pain that I encounter in working with estranged parents. In fact, I am an estranged parent. So we're dealing with something that's extremely painful, and this is not about me. This is about 5 million, at least, parents in the United States who are dealing with parental estrangement. What is parental estrangement? Well, it's not the typical experience of teenagers who regularly don't like you. I like this. When your children are teenagers, it's important to have a dog that someone in the house is happy to see. It's not the challenge of poor decision-making of children in their early 20s. The brain hasn't even fully developed by the time until you're 25 or so. So it's not that. It's not the garden variety tension over the holidays. I like this one too, stuffing the turkey with Prozac to help us all get through those holidays. It's when communication between a parent and their adult child or children has been severed or severely curtailed. That's what we mean by estrangement. Here's some considerations. We define an adult child as a child over 25 years of age. So parental estrangement begins basically for people in their early 50s. But the largest number of estranged parents are in their 70s and 80s. So this is the very years when you're having a number of losses set in. You've lost your parents, you've retired, often you've geographically located, you're dealing with one kind of illness or another often. You may have lost a sibling, lost some friends. And on top of all of those losses, parents are often experiencing their adult children saying, I also want nothing to do with you. And so that normal process where increased responsibility of adult children for their parents is aborted. And that's what I hear a lot from estranged parents. Who's going to be with me as I age? Who's going to take care of me as I age? How common is it? And these are the stats that really struck me. Because when I became an estranged parent, though I've been kind of in and out of this for 20 years now, I started Googling it. And I was like, what do you Google? I remember my first search term was children divorcing their parents, estrangement. I'd never even heard of it. And then I started to discover how big a problem this is in the United States, Western Europe, and I'm starting to get messages, I was just talking to someone this morning from Australia. About 12% of parent-adult-child relationships is estranged. So that's about 1 out of every 8. Now, you may say, I've never talked to anyone. I don't know anyone who's an estranged parent. Well, you probably do. They just haven't told you yet. Because it's very difficult to talk about. There's a lot of stigma around it. We're entering the holidays, and you're going to hear the message a lot, family is everything. Or something equivalent. Which is like, if you don't have family, you have nothing. And so the message in the holidays is very different. They're difficult, and there's this stigma that goes along with parental estrangement. There's a lot of shame connected to that as well. You feel like a failure. There's denial. Is another reason parents don't talk about it. Because it usually is more long-term than they think. In research that's done with estranged children, 75% of them say they can never imagine having a relationship, a functional relationship with their parent or parents again. If you ask that same question of the parents, 75% of them believe that they can and it will be resolved. So we have a lot of parents today who are hoping for something that is not ever going to happen. So, what are the factors people often ask? So if it's not just bad parents, what are the factors that contribute to it? Well, one is we're in a culture of estrangement. And one of the ways of illustrating that is just looking at our vocabulary. Are you familiar with the word ghosted? We're now talking, you hear folks talking about someone being ghosted. It means treating them as if they don't exist anymore. So you don't respond to their phone calls, you don't respond to their text messages, you just act as if they don't exist. This word ghosted, this is the frequency of the use of the word ghosted from 1980 to today. You can see what's happened with that word. Here's the phrase, you are dead to me. This is something that we're hearing said much more often now too. You are dead to me. You can look at the increase of that phrase over the last 40 years or so. This is the use of the phrase estranged children, also going up. But look at this, toxic family. More and more we are talking about toxic families. And someone wrote an article in The Atlantic, Caitlin Tiffany, it said suddenly everyone is toxic. People who don't agree with me are toxic. People who have a bad day in terms of hurting my feelings are toxic. And so we are finding that increasingly people, instead of finding ways to stay connected to folks who may be a little difficult, are declaring them toxic. Now, believe me, I understand there are abusive relationships where we need to make those, we need to establish those boundaries. But we're seeing this at a level that we have not seen before in society. So when it comes down to particular situations, the factors are all one-sided. 95% of parental estrangement, in 95% of the cases, it is the child who's cut off the relationship with the parent. I don't know why. I go back to my childhood, and somehow I thought parents cut off children. You know, you disown them, you cut them out of the will, and that kind of thing. That's not what we're seeing these days. It is the adult child who's cutting off the parents, and that withholding is a form of power. So what are the factors that contribute to that? Well, third-party influences are the big one. 90% of the time, there is a third party who's encouraging the estrangement. It can be a divorced spouse. It can be the person that your child chooses to marry, and they encourage the estrangement. It can be a friend of theirs. It can be a business associate. Sometimes it's a therapist. Sometimes it's a clergy person. So 90% of the time, there is a third party who's pushing for the estrangement. It's part of what makes it hard to deal with. And many of the times when we look at the case studies, they're dealing with just one-on-one, which is fairly easy, though very difficult still to deal with. It's that third party who's behind the scenes that makes estrangement especially difficult. Hardwired factors like mental illness. Had a man whose daughter was bipolar, disappeared 8 years ago, hasn't seen her since. So there sometimes are those kinds of mental health issues. There are situational factors, developmental or therapeutic. But sometimes we just don't know. It's a mystery. Even in the same family, you have one child who's estranged, another who isn't, grew up with the same parents in the same home. And I've seen this close up. A father who was, as a father in the childhood of their children, was difficult. And one child will say, he was tough, but that made me what I am today, gave me the leadership skills I have today, and I almost worship the ground he walks on. And another child will say, I don't want anything to do with him. He was abusive. And so that kind of difference in perspective makes it very difficult to say what causes parental estrangement. What are the impacts? All of these. Emotional pain, bewildered, but I won't speak. Let me share with you some things that people write me. My daughter's not spoken to me in 2 years. I am in agony. I get these kinds of messages almost every day. I'm 79 years old. I am now estranged from my 46-year-old son and 2 grandchildren for a little over a year. It's absolutely devastating. I have no idea what I did. 60% of estranged parents say, I don't know why this is happening. I feel ashamed and all alone. Help me not feel so alone in my grief. Isolated. My son hasn't spoken to me in over 7 years. I'm in therapy, but it's not enough. Please tell me where to go for help. Therapists often don't know how to deal with this issue. So that's part of what we do as training therapists. I feel I've lost my identity. How do you cope with the living death of a child? It's called ambiguous grief. It's like a missing person. Do I grieve them as dead and gone or not? That's a part of what makes this so difficult, this living death. 3 adult daughters, youngest is 26, diagnosed bipolar. 1 has cut ties with me, claims she needs to find healing through alternative medicine, needs space from me. I'm heartbroken. How do we help estranged parents? Here's the unwelcome news for estranged parents that many people don't want to say. In cases where an adult child over the age of 25 has totally cut off the relationship with the parent, the odds of a healthy reconciliation are probably 10% or less. So the answer is not in trying to find ways to reconcile the relationship and putting life on hold until that can happen. We have to help people deal with the trauma. This is the good news. We can help people deal with trauma. Recovery rate in dealing with trauma is 80 to 90%. And so what we do in Peak is we help estranged parents deal with the trauma of that loss, which will, if reconciliation is going to take place, put them in a better position for that to happen. So we work at creating resources, writing books. We're like AA in a way. You know, we have resources, we have daily readings, we have devotionals to help them with that. We have a YouTube channel, we've got a Facebook page. We're training service providers like clergy, like therapists, like estate attorneys, like hospice workers, folks who work with older adults. And we're developing peer recovery groups. So we have, I think, about 6 groups running now. We probably need several thousand in the United States to deal with all of the estranged parents that need recovery. What can you do to care for an estranged parent? Well, be willing to talk about it. That's one of the big things. Just be willing to talk about it. Recognize that estrangement's not rare, happens to the best of parents, is not a measure of health, competence, or worth. And if you see a parent who's avoiding talking about one of their children, or talks about a problem child, or showing other symptoms, ask them a question like this. Many parents today have adult children who have significantly curtailed their communication with them. Has that happened with any of your children? Has that happened with any of your children? And then, listen. Be sensitive in sharing about your child. Don't try to fix it. You will not fix it. Be sensitive in sharing about your children and grandchildren. It's very difficult. I've had people who know I'm an estranged parent. I'll spend an hour and a half with them. They'll spend the whole time talking about their children and grandchildren. And I'm not suggesting that you not do that, but just be sensitive to the fact. One of the things I love about Lyndon, when one of my first meetings with him, when he heard about this, he began to weep, and he gave me a hug. Because he's not estranged, but he knows what his children and grandchildren mean to him, and he can imagine what that must be like. That kind of compassion is extremely helpful. Adopt a no-fault, no-cause attitude. You know, it doesn't matter who caused it. I use the analogy of, you know, if a person is in a car crash and wheeled in a gurney into an emergency department, the staff doesn't step back and say, I'm not going to treat this person until I know if it's their fault. We treat people because they're human beings. Whatever their failures, whatever their faults, we have a saying in Peak, everyone deserves to recover. Focus on their self-care, what they can do to take care of themselves. Maintain healthy boundaries. Don't let yourself get drawn into trying to mediate a situation. Again, you probably will not be successful. Tune in on special days. You know, call them during the holiday season. What are they doing on Thanksgiving? What are they doing on Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever their holiday celebrations? Mother's Day, Father's Day. Call them up, check on them, see how they're doing. And watch for signs of trouble. Probably a third of estranged parents are having suicidal ideation at some point in that process. So watch if they get into trouble, and don't hesitate to call suicide hotline. This is one of my favorite adapted quotes from Henry Nouwen. I talk to strangers every day. I'm not their friend. But I believe that all of us can have a big impact on people, even if we hardly know them, if we'll listen and show compassion. I love this quote. The touch of the hand, a look in the eye, can outweigh years of friendship when a person is in agony. And I found that to be absolutely true. So we're encouraged in that we're seeing a tremendous amount of healing in people. And it's extremely hopeful and gratifying. But there's many more people that we need to reach with this message. So I'm going to stop here and see what kind of questions or comments you may have about parental estrangement. Yes, in the back.
I guess the question that came immediately to mind for me is, to what degree the child has a full awareness of the impact of their behavior upon the parent. In other words, a woman who hasn't heard from her child for 8 years, maybe they would understand that a single phone call per year might allay that pain. And I don't know whether a third person would approach the child and say, this is the impact of what you're doing. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, this is a difficult one because I think many times estranged children are angry and they want their parent to suffer. So letting them know how much you're suffering generally does not prove to be helpful. Again, they are in pain as well for whatever reasons. And I think it's difficult for them to kind of see beyond that pain. What happens is you have what's called the lack of a co-created narrative. You have a story as parent, they have a story as child. And those two don't meet. They have the same set of facts, but they apply a totally different story to that set of facts and the motivations that they assign. And so that one of the challenges is all the things that typically work in relationship, like if you say to somebody, I want you to know I'm sorry. You say, oh, okay, I forgive you or I accept that. If you do that with an estranged child, they're likely to say, you don't really mean it. You don't really believe that. Stop saying that to me. I've asked you not to talk to me. Or if you say, I love you, what you often get back is, no you don't. You don't really. If you did, you'd do something differently. So the things that we normally, you give a gift. You send a gift. You send a gift to grandchildren. But what you get back is, now you're trying to buy us, you're trying to put our grandchildren, your grandchildren in the middle. You can always create a narrative around a set of facts that interprets it in a very different way. And until a parent and a child can come together and create a shared narrative, not much can change. So I think sharing those impacts don't really work because they fit into their narrative in a different way than they fit into our narrative. Other questions? Yes.
As you were speaking, I know two people that I'm really close to. Actually, my sister-in-law is estranged from my in-laws, but they don't seem to be outwardly struggling with it. My father-in-law in particular, I don't know. And so I'm curious, would you recommend encouraging them to be a little bit more aware of the fact that this is very common and that maybe some of the trauma they may have internalized it to some degree and are feeling it, or do you just let it go? Since
I would always encourage people to talk about it and let them know the degree to which this is happening in our society and the kind of impacts they're having. It's interesting. I find that folks are having medical issues and they've never made the connection to the estrangement. So I've started doing a kind of screening process when I talk with estranged parents, and I've got a list that I go through now in terms of, what's happening with your sleep, what's happening with your behaviors, are you drinking a little bit more than you did, those kinds of things. But one of the questions I ask is, so what's happening with you physically? And I'm like, when was the onset of those symptoms? And it's not unusual that they'll say, I never made the connection between my arrhythmia or my dermatitis and the estrangement. So often they may not have enough information to know how to connect what's happening in their life to the estrangement. So I would encourage that. I think also the book I wrote, Peak, would be something that would be a useful resource to any estranged parent. Yes?
I'm thinking that our generation has some share in culpability with this, in that we did not properly teach our children what their duties and obligations were. I personally came from a family with a level of abuse which by today's standards would have caused probably intervention by the maybe being taken out of the home. Yet, I had two brothers. None of the three of us felt that my parents became aged and sick and went through all the difficulties that, you know, we're facing now. That I wasn't under obligation to see them or help them. And they acted very independent, but occasionally they'd say, I need your help. And despite our childhood, I didn't say, I'm not going to do that. I don't have any good reason to help them because I felt like it was my duty. It didn't matter whether it felt right or not.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's where we dropped the ball.
What's your first name?
Paul.
Paul. Yeah, Paul. I hear this so many times from our generation. You know, none of us grew up in perfect homes, and some of us grew up in homes that were abusive. But there is this sense of obligation and duty. And so we're kind of in the generation where we have this expectation that we take care of parents, but we also now are dealing with this expectation or pain coming from our children. And so it puts us in that sandwich generation that's struggling. So what we hear from the younger generation, though, about this is that that is seen as a defect in us. It's like you weren't strong enough to stand up for yourself, and we are. Right? Again, it's all about narrative. It's all about how it gets framed. And so I know exactly what you're saying. I felt the same way about my parents. I know my wife felt the same way about her parents, and we hear this a lot. But it's a very different set of values, I think, than our children are dealing with. So thank you for that comment. Okay, I think we're at 11:24.
One more? Yep. David?
Yeah.
When I see people that are in this kind of situation, they often make a choice to totally withdraw and just, they in turn ghost who ghosted them.
Yes.
Is there a way to keep the pilot light on in the event of some future fuel that might rekindle a relationship?
Yeah, I think there can be in terms of some minimal contact. I think cutoff is basically, in family systems theory, a way of dealing with anxiety. So when we have anxiety in a family system, and this is transgenerational, you know, you can go back sometimes to parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and find stories of cutoff. And it's basically because we don't know how to handle anxiety. We don't know how to have relationships where we establish boundaries and know how to deal with that. So I think in many cases, we can continue to send cards or letters or some minimal communication, as you say, to keep the pilot light burning. In other situations, that actually becomes more problematic because in the views of the adult child, we're violating boundaries that they have established and ask us to honor. So any kind of step in that direction merely as fuel to the fire in terms of their anger or frustration with us that we're not honoring the boundary that they've set. So yes, in some cases, in other cases, no. I had a parent that so missed her grandchildren that she lived in the same community, that she would go and just sit in her car and watch her children get out of school, not interact with them, not do anything, and she was out of sight. But another parent saw her and reported it to the parents, and they called the police, and because she was stalking the child. Now, there's no criminal behavior here, there's no criminal behavior in the background. It is how things get interpreted. It's the narrative. And that's a part of what we struggle with, is the narrative. But again, I want to leave this on a hopeful note that we do find the ability when parents can come together in a setting like this and support one another to find love, to find acceptance, to find some practical guidance, frankly. Healing is possible. And that's what gets me up in the morning. It's seeing the positive, redemptive impact of love and compassion on parents who are dealing with some of the worst pain you could ever experience. I'll be around for a little while if you want to talk to me, or if you have questions, or you have folks that need to talk to me, need to put in touch with me. I got a card. I'd be happy to do this. It's a major part of my life. Thank you, Lyndon. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it.
So Derek and Becky are going to come up now and lead us in a song, right?
Yes. Okay, that's what it is. A couple measures. You can play the game, you can act out the part, but you know it wasn't written for you. Tell me, how can you stand there with your broken heart, ashamed of playing the fool? One thing can lead to another, take any sacrifice. Father and mother, sister and brother, if it feels nice, don't think twice. Shower the people you love or love, show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna work out fine if you only will. Shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna be much better if you only will. You can run, but you cannot hide. This is widely known. What you plan to do with your foolish pride when you're all by yourself alone? Once you toss the money the way that you feel, you can feel it beginning to ease. Think it's true what they say about the squeaky wheel, always is getting the grease. Shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna work out fine if you only will. Shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna be much better if you only will. Can you go once more? Shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna work out fine if you only will. Shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna be much better if you only will. Hopeful thinking anyway, right?
Yes. So let us say together and responsively, I'll read the first part of the sentence and you can repeat it back to me as our closing affirmation. We extinguish the flame of this chalice.
Extinguish the flame of this chalice.
Let us follow the light of truth.
Let us follow the light of truth.
Until we meet again.
Until we meet again.
And now it's time for a group hug at the coffee pot. Thank you, Faye.